Now, speaking of rediscovering or discovering the love of music, going on to the next topic. Um, so you had the great fortune of studying with one of, I mean, I think we would both agree, one of the great pianists and artists in the world today, and the great maestro Sergei Babayan, who, um, as you probably know, I am really close friends with a lot of his disciples, so I kind of have an idea of just how incredible he is already. Um, can you just talk a little bit about how you came to study with him at CIM, and also just how your time with him and how his outlook on music helped shape your own views on music today?
Well, I was so fascinated by your use of the word disciples because that I think that's so fitting because we all felt like we were worshiping him
Yeah,
in a way.
yeah.
I mean, for better or for worse. I can speak for myself and maybe a few others. We wanted to be him. We wanted to walk, talk, and dress like him. He's just a larger than life personality. He's so charismatic and he projects an more than anything else, he projects an inspiration, a contagious inspiration for life. He's living so much in the moment.
Yeah.
He always makes you feel that each moment is special and that each moment you're just one step away from a life-changing discovery.
Mhm.
That is so exciting to be around, especially when I first met him, I was 16.
Mhm.
When you're around someone who makes you feel that way and believe that, you just feel like you can do anything. So there's a really, really empowering quality about him. I was in high school in Boston at Walnut Hill, and I was having trouble connecting with teachers. As I said, I was kind of not just kind of I was a difficult person who didn't really trust my teachers that much. I always felt like, okay, my convictions for what I want through music, it's different. So at some point I said, well, what am I going to do next
Mhm.
after I graduate from Walnut Hill?
Mhm.
Where do I go? Should I just go to some school with a big name like Juilliard? Should I
Right.
should I do that?
Mhm.
Um, but then it became clear I needed to find a teacher who was very, very inspiring on a personal level. So at some point, my mom called me up and she said, there's Clavier magazine. I just saw an ad from the Cleveland Institute of Music where they were just listing their piano faculty. And there's a
Mhm.
name there that I looked into, she
Mhm.
said. There's Sergei Babayan. He even at this point, he was 38 at that time, which is humbling. I'm 40 now. I'm older. I mean, when I was studying with him, he seemed like so much older.
Yeah.
I looked up to him. I upscaled his age. Like 38 was like
Yeah.
55 for
Yeah.
me. So my response to my mom at that time was something kind of abrupt. I said, "Well, just because he's Russian doesn't necessarily mean he's good." Of course, that was such a stupid thing to say. He was Armenian. He was studying in Russia with all the great Russian teachers. He was steeped in that tradition. But then my mom called me back, and she said, I really think you should pay attention to this guy and look into him. Why don't you go to Cleveland
Mhm.
and take some lessons with him and see how that goes?"
Mhm.
Um, and I said, "Why would I want to go to Cleveland?" I had no idea what Cleveland was. But I went there. And I had kind of the advantage of being kind of this bullheaded kid. Um, I didn't read up on him to know anything about his reputation or who he was. So I wasn't intimidated when I played for him. I played and then I did my huge, I was very passionate about the pieces I played for him. I remember it was Beethoven Opus 2 number 3. I played Ravel Jadot. The lesson ended up being like 3.5 hours.
Oh, wow.
And I could see there was this immediate sense of connection with him. I could see he was fascinated by me. He's like, who is this kid who is like behaving in such a, I don't know, I probably was emanating some type of attitude. But then I was quickly disarmed when I saw how he was listening to me. And then he was responding to me and reacting off of things. Then he'd go to the piano and demonstrate some things. And I felt like things were coming alive. And then I instantly fell in love with him on every level, him as a musician, him as a man. I just said, who is this? Let's have more lessons. So I think I flew in one or two more times to Cleveland from Boston within that busy time. And then it started to come up on the summer. And he said, "What are you doing this summer? There's a summer study institute in France, and I think you should come. We could continue our lessons there, and you can have lessons with all the great teachers, including two of his teachers. There was Lev Naumov, who had been assistant to Heinrich Neuhaus, who taught
Oh,
Richter
wow.
and Gilels and Radulupu.
Oh,
I didn't
wow.
realize that at that time. And then Vera Gornostaeva, who had been his main teacher
Mm,
at Moscow Conservatory.
right.
So they were all there. There were amazing performances, um, and I experienced that. By the end of that institute, I realized I I feel like it has to be him as my teacher or nobody else.
Mhm.
And so I was totally gravitated towards him. At the end of this session, I said to him, because he knew I was going to say something to him like, "I want to study with
Mhm.
you." But I was so awkward and nervous that when we walked into that room, I sat down and I said to him, for some reason, the opposite. I said, "So what would you like to hear from me?" So his response to me was, "What would I like to hear from you?" And he said, and there's a reason I'm bringing this up. He says,
Mhm.
"Joel, I would like to hear you offer me a Deutsche Grammophon contract, a teaching contract at Juilliard, and a concert at Carnegie Hall. So that's what I would like to hear you say to me."
Mhm.
Recently, I called him up and I said to him, Sergey, that whole thing back then, you've achieved all those things.
Yes,
You've
I
achieved
was
all
about
those
to
things.
say.
Yeah. But anyway, I told him that I really wanted to study with him, and at that time he only had 5 or 6 students, so I
Right.
was really fortunate to study with him.
Mm.
The experience of studying with him, we felt very, very privileged and fortunate to study in his studio. It was small, and we were all friends,
Mm.
and we felt like we were his friends, family, and his whole life. We would have these lessons all the time. We felt like the special people.
Yeah.
We were living in our little Sergei Babayan bubble.
Yeah.
So we'd have lessons, 3 or 4 times a week, and each of these lessons could last up to 3 hours.
Oh, wow.
It felt so exciting that we were shaping things to the finest level and that we would feel we were getting better. It's
Mhm.
also unbelievably challenging and difficult.
Mm.
But after these lessons, he would sometimes cook for us, and then
Yeah.
we would talk about life and talk about movies and recordings. And again, it was just a feast of discoveries.
Yeah.
That's what it was. His lessons also felt like an incredible array of creativity from a single brilliant
Yeah.
musician and human being.
Yeah.
He would describe things on the level of, he would try to inspire us through imagery,
Yeah.
come up with all these fantastic ideas, I think some of which were passed along from his teachers,
Mm.
but then many of his own, because he was reacting off of us. And he would
Right.
come up with stories of it, like, "Why are you playing it that way?" And then he'd come up with a story, "Why did you do that?" And
Mm.
we'd all laugh.
Yeah.
I miss those days.
Yeah.
I miss those days because there was so much togetherness.
Yeah.
There was so much togetherness, and there was a sense of moving forward with your goals. That's part of what I tried to do and foster on living the classical life, a sense of togetherness and community,
Mm.
so that people realize we're all trying to shape our goals together.
Yeah.
That's what I
Which
would
I'm
say.
no, I mean, and I think you've done a really awesome job at that. And I'm glad you mentioned family because, going back to my friends, that's the feeling I get when I talk about Mr. Babayan with my friends is he's cultivated so well this sense of family within his studio, and I really believe he looks at his students, former or current, as his own, and that's I think where that comes from. And again, I love what you mentioned about the creativity because what I so often notice with a lot of his students is they bring out so many different colors that I've almost never heard on the piano that his students are able to do, and they're able to bring you into their world of imagination fairly early into their performances. So I'm glad that you mentioned all that because that's all so fantastic. Yeah.
Well, the risk, of course, when we're studying and we're constantly around such an overwhelming personality and musician, is we want so much to be like them that we're very much in an imitative phase, right? Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Renaissance painters copied their masters, but I don't think I really had I don't think I really started developing any kind of sense of independent, unique voice until after I graduated. Because with these lessons, you're following so many instructions and you're just trying to get them right. And then you keep in mind your image, visual and sound of your teacher, and you want to achieve that. Didn't you feel like, your experience of conservatory was there was an imitative phase, and then maybe later after graduation, and particularly in my experience, when you start teaching other people, then you're like, oh, now I understand what my teacher was trying to convey, and now I get kind of the parameters. Did you ever feel that way?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think because, especially when we're younger, I think we look up, and rightfully so, to so many of our teachers that we study with. And I think just almost kind of without thinking about it, we start to kind of talk or act or play like the teachers that we study with. And so I totally agree and see what you mean by that. So,
and it's tricky because your teachers, in this case, Sergey became like a second father to me, a friend, a confidant, kind of a psychologist at times when I needed that, which was frequently. But someone who always inspired me. In a year from now, he's moving away from Cleveland, which is astonishing to consider.
Yeah.
And so I've had a lot to consider in terms of when do we break free from what we think is our shelter of being within under the umbrella of our strong influences. When do we become our own independent people exploring our own paths? Yeah, I'm still figuring that out. But I think at any juncture of life, we're just trying to do our best.
Right.
Yeah.